All right, so this is this is intended to be notes towards Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, subtitle, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And I suppose if this segment were to be given a part, it would be interlude or intermission, because I don't intend to reiterate and elaborate upon on David's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Non-Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling today, specifically, but perhaps to paranarratively relate stories and incidents that seem to tie into the discussion that we've been engaging in relationship to David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And so I don't really consider this part 11, since it doesn't relate back directly to the 16 parts of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, but it's certainly, related conceptually and associatively as well, and we'll talk about what that association means. So this interlude or this intermission, if it were to be given a number, I suppose it would be something like 5 plus 5, and the reason that it would be 5 plus 5 is it's not particularly complicated or complex, but bears upon this idea that I often work with, that one could describe as conflux or confluence, and the reason, and it's a kind of Jungian synchrony, but the reason that I don't refer to it as coincidence is because coincidence implies a random accident and situates itself too firmly within the stability of the metaphysics of chance, as if that the processes and the currents in which we drift were merely random and not the result of numerous overdetermined forces that although we may not entirely be able to account for, are really in no way any more random than the arrangement of the stars, or I guess some people imagine that the stars are random, but the reason that they're where they are is because they resulted from great cosmic forces, right? And the physics of how they ended up, where they are and when they are, isn't just a part of the creative imagination that involves, the way that we constellate them and create them as meanings, but to the physical dynamics of the universe, which has just as significant a number, right, of rules as any literary form does, and just as significant a number of way of playing out those rules as any social construction does. So I'll get to the confluence of the two fives shortly, but first I'll say something about this green serpent or snake. This is the image that's on the desktop for today, and since I really don't like filming myself as a talking head speaking, I've chosen this to be the focus as I narrate and as I discourse on these memories that relate in a certain way to where we've ended up in our discussion of David Antin's varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling. And I thought this, this is I'm not entirely certain what this snake is. It looks somewhat elapid-like to me, and therefore it may be related to the family of cobras, and it may be a poisonous snake, or perhaps it's not. I suppose if it's a poisonous snake and it's green, this color, it could be a green mamba, which I guess would place it in South America, I believe, as an origin. But I also thought about, anagrammatically how the letters in the noun phrase green snake, might be rearranged, and I realized that there was a Greek in there, and perhaps a sane in there, and then an extra N, which would, I guess if we converted it into a number, which would take us to 11, which would be the next installment on our discussion of David Antin's varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling. And Lori's sick today, so she's unfortunately suffering from the deleterious effects of this virus that I gave her. In close quarters, it's very difficult not to communicate one's virus to someone that one lives with closely, no matter how carefully one tries to avoid that. So she's having tea this morning while I'm having coffee. I made her some hibiscus tea, which, if anyone is not aware, hibiscus tea is not only a sort of curative health reference to Ma Durga, but also on the physical level contains significant amount of vitamin C, and is much more health productive than coffee, particularly if one is dealing with the symptoms of a virus. So highly recommended. But the Greek, and perhaps less the sane, but the Greek in there, and then the extra N that we're left with, both seem to point to this the series that we're engaging with, and particularly with all of the Greek muses that we've either referenced or invented as a part of this discussion, and elaborated on it. And you'll recall that the last muse that we really attempted to engage, this muse of perfection, that I tried to argue, or that David tried to argue, belongs to a certain domain of high art and facility and perfection of performance and clarity and the absence of error and in a sense hospitality and presentation and all of those things that if if we engage, significantly in terms of socio-political critique that that includes symbolic formations that ensure and operate within domains, right, of social organization, we have to say that this belongs to this high art notion of this high art notion of one could say manners and clarity and sort of uncritical notions of I used the word hospitality before. It's not quite the word that I want, but uncritically engaged notions of let's just say manners. And recently I had the opportunity to listen to a recording of William Carlos Williams reading a poem called "Smell," in which he criticizes his nose. So sort of looking down his nose at the idea of looking up his nose, I suppose. But I it struck me immediately, what a profoundly bourgeois and that's not a term that people like to use anymore because that old-fashioned kind of IWW socialism isn't in fashion, but every once in a while, that old IWW style labor union, dusty jacketed, gritty Joe Hill style socialism, really appeals to me. And William Carlos Williams, certainly falls far out of that. Although the snake reference here, the snake as medicine spirit and creature of healing, right? As represented in the Greek symbol for medicine, the caduceus. And actually, there's an interesting there's an interesting story about the origin of the caduceus that perhaps relates in part to our paranarratological narratives involving misremembering, misidentifying, failure, to perceive, the exact outlines and the precision, right? Errors in not only in interpreting words and signs and information, but errors in perceiving, right? Like that word that I was unable to perceive in Bob Perlman's discourse, whether it was aggression, digression, regression, or and then it never even occurred to me, to think of it as transgression, which is certainly a part of the avant-garde. And we've been attempting to separate out, exactly, what the avant-garde might be compared to, high art modes of modernist art making, like it's still possible to identify Marcel Duchamp as belonging to the avant-garde, but do we really want to include Pablo Picasso in the avant-garde rather than perhaps relocating him to a modality of high art modernism, and that argument or discussion or a set of disagreements and agreements that belong to the theoretical project of defining the avant-garde is something that we're engaged in this moment as we look at the details of the manners, right, and some cultural symbolic value through which an item or symbolic construct like the grand piano, whether it was produced and made on Steinway Street or elsewhere, by Steinway and Company or some other manufacturer, the weight, right, the weight and authority and respectability, right, that it lends to whatever creative project that it's brought into as the medium upon which that artistic expression is made, as opposed to, say, a bugle or a harmonica, if we want to turn to the idea of the construction, right, of this artistic identity that someone like Bob Dylan makes. So there's this external framing device, very much like in Kathy Acker, of the narrative of Bob Dylan and his gritty rubbing elbows with the tired, hungry masses on the railroad or wherever, right, riding the rails, and this mythos of Bob Dylan, is certainly is enhanced, right, by the contribution that a musical instrument such as a harmonica, which one can put in one's pocket and carry with one, as one hops trains or drinks hobo coffee with the fellow rail riders, right? Hobo coffee. I don't know if there's anything that we've done on hobo coffee recently. There is a piece somewhere. I don't know if it still exists, but but hobo coffee is simply coffee that's made with ordinary ground coffee, but when one doesn't have the kinds of machines that we make coffee in, like I'm certain that in a coffee house such as the Grand Piano, they must have had elaborate and complex coffee brewing devices, because this is kind of barista coffee, right? And we'll get to that eventually, and we'll get to the way that barista coffee plays itself out as a certain social circle, right? And as opposed to the kind of coffee that's brewed over a campfire in a tin pan and boiled in this certain way and then filtered in this certain way, and that's what I'm referring to as hobo coffee. There are no intended derogatory or offensive. I don't intend using the word hobo to me isn't offensive, and I for individuals who are homeless or displaced, I don't mean it to be or intend it to be in any way offensive, and if it is, apologize in advance for that. But that's simply the word that that I'm familiar with this means of brewing coffee that I have often utilized in situations in which no other means are available, I guess. And I guess that's in some ways the opposite of learned helplessness. But we were talking about before I engaged this digression, right, which I guess is another reference to what could be one aspect of the avant-garde, as opposed to the clarity and directness, right, of a high art style presentation. And I'll engage one more, digression before we go there. When I worked, or was getting out of working in, or something, social services, one of the positions that I occupied was as a job developer, and basically, the job development meant you did your best to find work for unemployed individuals, whether they were displaced or not, that might have obstacles in attaining employment. And my supervisor in one of these positions, was advising me on my style of presentation in different contexts, because I was required to give presentations and sort of information generated, right, presentations regarding labor markets and means of acquiring position and strategies and all of this to various different groups of individuals, and some of those individuals were defined by the fact that they belonged to programs because they had disabilities or had incurred injury in their jobs, and this was why they were currently unemployed, and then others were others belonged to sets of industry and labor that for one reason or another failed because of basically because of the nature of capitalism. But we didn't really talk about that in this program, but that either had been laid off or lost their jobs, meaning because the market had dried up, or because the industry really was uncaring and built on self-motivated and opportunistic models of production and employment. So so that was another circle, and then there were circles of or communities of fellow employment service workers that I also presented to, and then there were circles of employers that I presented to, and then there were circles of what you might call intermediaries, right? So that often if you're working with an individual or a group of individuals, who have a particular kind of disability, say that this is, a disability that belongs to cognitive or learning development, right? Then there are organizations within the community, within the county, state, and probably at the national level as well. Although I didn't deal with many national intermediaries, but there are organizations that support groups of individuals that require, for one reason or another, assistance in living or in the acquirement of resources and other kinds of support. So in San Diego, one of those organizations was called was called the regional center, and the regional center was an intermediary for me when I was assisting individuals with developmental disabilities and learning disabilities and other kinds of neurocognitive differences, who might have difficulty acquiring employment and keeping employment, and my relationship to that agency was both one of exchanging information and of determining who would between our various interactions, who would be responsible for which element of support, meaning who would be responsible for follow up on job training, and who would be responsible for assistance in transportation, and all of these things both require labor and financing, right? So if you're driving someone to work, that's labor, but gas costs money. So this particular social services industry, the community center, which was organized at the county level, could assist in either one of those dimensions, labor or financial resources, and we had to negotiate all that. All right. Anyway, so not even sure how we ended up there as an aside, but I was talking about the caduceus, and which also returns us to our focus on these Greek ideas in more than one way. So the green snake, having this word Greek in its if one breaks down the letters in the morphological unit that constitutes the noun phrase, one finds there the sane Greek snake, or sane Greek, I guess, and then one's left with this additional letter N, which I discussed as perhaps being a reference to the next element in the series, which would be the 11th part, right after the 10th part. But the caduceus, it may return us to this idea of medicine, and perhaps the discourse in a certain way is a kind of medicine, in a way that Carlos Williams discourse. Am I allowed to say this, or will someone object? I suppose it doesn't really matter. It has always seemed to me that whatever it is that William Carlos Williams performed as a doctor, or as a performer of the healing arts, that his poetry, and this is maybe just my reading of it, is rather a break or an intermission from that, rather than an extension of it. And I suppose, and there must be someone out there who's written on William Carlos Williams as a poet of medicine, but I don't see it. I see the poetry as this as very much a kind of weekend, a getting away from the art of medicine and playing, right? Like playing the kind of funny and obnoxious in a way, right? Naked dancing in dance, ruse, or the stealing of the plums, or it's all and it's done in a playful manner, and perhaps even in this this poem against the nose, right? But it's interesting because smell is very, very important in as a survival strategy and a tool, right, a perceptual tool in strategies that animals have, both in mating and in surviving, right? It's a means of acquiring resources, and it's this very domesticated, kind of mannerly like way that human beings have of organizing the apparatuses of perception into the high and the low, that bears upon perhaps why William Carlos Williams could never ever be conceived of as an avant-garde artist if one really wanted to seriously make a distinction between avant-garde and high modernism, right? But the eye, right? The eye is the most privileged of all of the organs of perception, and you can't really see them, but the tympanic membrane that this snake has, whether it's mamba or some other kind of snake, whether it's an elapid or some other kind of snake, it's they do hear, and they hear vibrations just like we do, and the ear would be the next single most privileged in this hierarchy of organs, and then perhaps touch, perhaps, if we discount intuition as a sense that belongs, I guess, because it's close to it's a perception. Intuition is a perception that's close to an inner understanding, and hence associated with mind, perhaps more than touch. But if we discount intuition, perhaps touch, and then I'm tempted to say that taste is more privileged than smell, which is odd, but those two are clearly related to one another. And then finally smell, and one is considered vulgar, both if one smells and if one readily concedes the idea that a lot of the information that one gathers through this sense organ of that perceives odor, right? Now dogs, which take on various relationship to our understanding of culture, in relationship to high and low, and are often maligned and used as pejorative projections or or references to human behavior, right? Have and I'm not sure what it's called, but they have something that is an intermediate interface between the brain and the olfactory organ, and you could call it something like a nose brain. But a dog, unlike a human, if it smells another dog, it will be able to determine a lot of things about that dog. Like it would be able to determine, based on the smell of the dog, whether that dog just returned from the bourgeois coffee house, the grand piano, or whether it had taken its midday lunch at Street Taco, and it would be able to tell if that dog were ill or had any kinds of disease, and it would be able to tell a lot about the dog's owner, whether that owner was a male human or a female human. It would certainly be able to recognize the dog's gender, by smell, and in addition to whether knowing whether the dog was ill or not, it would also be able to identify whether that dog was in heat if it were a female, in estrus if it were a female, and a variety of other informational details that our noses, and their primitive development, would not be able to convey, to our brains, and thus to the apparatus of our perception and interpretation, right? So there's a lot that would be left out, and I don't know if William Carlos Williams is aware of all of that or not, but in having the opportunity to listen to his reading of this this looking down the nose at the up the nose, I realized, that how offensive I found his mannerliness in a way, and playing out, in this weird way, right? A kind of a kind of prudishness at his own sense of vulgarity, and all of those social constructs. It seemed to me were very much like involved in this play of manners, and I suppose I've always in a way thought of William Carlos Williams as a poet of manners and mannerisms, and that's probably why that I'm not really interested in his poetics in a way that I would be interested in the poetics of some of his contemporaries, whether American or otherwise, the surrealists or Gertrude Stein or others that are roughly contemporaneous, and to me much more interesting because perhaps that they aren't poets of manners and the polite and social convention and arrangement and organization, seeking this kind of error-free formal modality of organizing and experiencing the world, but actually become investigators of the unconscious. And of course the serpent here that is today in part occupying the role of the Destop Ekphrasis, and in part occupying this self-portrait of who I might be, a kind of mask for what otherwise could merely be my talking head. And but we were moving towards the story of the caduceus, and the caduceus is interesting because the central element in the caduceus, it's coiled around, two snakes coil around this central staff, but the central staff is winged and represents the god Hermes, and supposedly this caduceus or this staff belonged to the god Hermes, the messenger of the gods, and and hence the wings, because he was required to fly about, to convey messages, among the gods and between the gods and heroes. Largely, we say humans, but humans, as they are defined in Greek mythology, are a very special category of entities, because almost all of them, as recently we traced back Laius, right? Laius, the father of Oedipus, we traced his origins, back through the gods, and there are two genealogical narratives, and they're slightly they overlap in ways, but the genealogy is uncertain at a single point. But you can either trace Laius's ancestry back through Poseidon, or you can trace it back through Zeus, or perhaps both, on a mother and a father's side, which is, at somewhere along the line of the genealogy, there's a branch. And so he is either or and and I can't even remember how many generations it is, but let's say that Laius is the great grandson of either Poseidon or Zeus or both, because somewhere along the line, the parentage split, and maybe it was a mother that was a daughter of someone, or a father, or whose father was a descendant of Zeus's, and anyway, so either Zeus or Poseidon, or perhaps both, and hence can be traced back to Kronos, and then beyond Kronos to Uranus. But what makes that interesting is that Laius, who intends to kill his son, right, when his son is born, we often in Freud, he sort of singularly focuses on the fact that that Oedipus wants to kill his father, which he doesn't even really want to do. He's trying to avoid it, but he's destined to do it, right? But he ignores the fact that Laius was the initiator of this death struggle to begin with, right? It's like, because he's the one who had Oedipus bound as a child, and sent him out to be thrown over the rocks, right? Or destroyed as a child. So anyway, so Laius can trace his ancestry back to Kronos and Uranus, both of whom were child destroyers, and I find that interesting in a certain way. So it's certainly Eliade would certainly identify that that repetition of this particular mode that exists in Greek mythology as an example of the eternal return, right? You can never really escape the cycles of either the seasons or the history and sins of your ancestry. But in any case, this caduceus, the central staff of which belonged to the god Hermes, and hence the wings. There's a story in which he's said to have separated these two arguing and fighting serpents with this staff, and in this story, this is one variation of the story of the caduceus. Then he separates these snakes, and they become and this act, right, of mitigating conflict, right? The messenger who mitigates conflict. Okay, so say there was a conflict about is John Cage part of high modernism, or does John Cage significant can his work significantly be represented as an aspect of the avant-garde? And you could say, well, does he use a grand piano? Now that might be too simple. That might be too simple, and you might say, well, maybe there's an aspect of the transgressive in the avant-garde, and it's certainly there in Marcel Duchamp, but you can't entirely define the avant-garde by this muse of transgression, right? Parabasis. Because if it was just Parabasis, that just seems too easy, and it's not overdetermined enough, right? Or perhaps it fails to account for all of those examples. Now, even if we wanted to say, well, let's certainly not include Gertrude Stein in the avant-garde because of this investment in bourgeois middle class culture. Isn't there something nevertheless lurking in the way that her inventiveness and rearticulation of language and deployment of language is a kind of transgression, a kind of transgression against certain understandings of the way that narrative development develops, or understandings of unfolding in time that her idea of the continuous present really challenge in, if not a transgressive way, in a way that so completely alters and and challenges our former understanding of a phenomenon. In this case, the phenomenon is narrating itself, right? That it can be said to belong to this aspect of the avant-garde that is experimental. So perhaps there's an experimental muse as well, and then if that's the case, then we start to be able to bring in Picasso, because he certainly was experimental, right? So the terms under which we allow ourselves to compound, right, the elements in the if we were gonna be good Jacobsonians and find a dominant in the avant-garde itself and say this was the feature, and without this feature you can't have it, then that would be problematic. But if we look at it from a different perspective, right? We had been talking about Zorn's lemma, and whether you can conceive of it as first let's think about it this way. We had been talking about Zorn's lemma, and then Hollis Frampton's if you like structural American filmmaker Hollis Frampton. And if you don't like the term structural film, then just discount that and say experimental filmmaker. If you like avant-garde, you can do that, or if you like high art, you can put that there. But his use of this construct, Zorn's lemma, as a title, and then we had talked about whether taking the apostrophe out was an error on Hollis Frampton's part, or whether putting it back in was an error on the part of anyone writing about Zorn's lemma. And then we had talked about justifications that were made in perceiving this as an error in one direction or another. And I believe I hinted at, and I may be misremembering this. I may be misremembering this altogether. But I remember in an engagement and a discussion, or attempt to discuss, because you really couldn't discuss these things, but an attempt to discuss, the problematic removal of the comma with a film person from the Chicago Reader named Fred Camper. That there was a kind of intervention on the part of P. Adams Sidney, and P. Adams, and I may be misremembering this as well, but said that the reason that the apostrophe was missing in Zorn's lemma was because that, and I may be misremembering this, and I don't even know how one would go back and reconstitute the event. And this is why I guess this piece relates to these aspects of paranarratology and deception, because they engage these ideas of memory and telling and how as memory truth seems to change over time. But what I remember in the discussion was that P. Adams said that the reason that Hollis Frampton didn't put the comma in Zorn's lemma, which is clearly possessive, right, and in English possesses the comma, is because he's referring to it back in the original German, in which it would have been designated without the comma, and I didn't, I suppose I was trying to be polite and good-mannered and fall within that discursive those discursive constraints of mannerisms in which I no longer belonged to the avant-garde and the transgressive. But I didn't say anything, but I thought, well, if if he wanted to write it in German, why wouldn't he just have put Lemma von Zorn, right? I mean, isn't that maybe I'm not a fluent German speaker, but wouldn't that be the German? Anyway, but see, that's my memory of it, and not being a German grammarian, and not, I mean, the only the only German that I ever grew up with was Plattdeutsch, and Plattdeutsch is not German any more than Yiddish is Hebrew, right? So, and I only grew up with that in little snippet periods in which I spent parts of the summer with my grandparents. So I remember a few Mennonite nursery rhymes in Plattdeutsch, but I don't know German, and I don't know how to form plurals or possessives in German. But I always thought that the von was the possessive, and maybe there are multiple possessives in German that I don't know about. But I did I studied briefly studied linguistics in the 80s when Chomsky and transformational grammar was the dominant operative in interpreting both the history of the development of language and the structure of language as it relates to this idea of being for Chomsky a human universal. Now yeah, I'm certain that there were examples in my study of language overall that included German, but obviously they didn't constitute enough and a significant amount of data for me to know much about it. And but anyway, this was the problem. Where was the error made? Was the error made by Frampton, or was it intended? And was it intended to be an error, or was the error made by someone who re-added the apostrophe, or was the error made by or maybe all of us? I don't know, or was the error made by P. Adam Sidney when he suggested that the German possessive, singular form of Zorn's lemma. Did I say Zorn's lemma? Zorn's lemma. That the possessive singular form of Zorn's lemma in German would be, Zorn's lemma without the apostrophe, as opposed to Lemma von Zorn, which is, I don't know. It just seems to me like, without knowing German, that just seems right. I don't know why. But returning to this, idea of Zorn's lemma, which proposes, certain, ideas about sets in which implications made on the basis of what can be recognized and perceived as a partial set, can be constituted as elements defined within that set, even if they're not complete. And recently, there was a discussion of whether you can on ModPo, whether you can call a couplet a sonnet because it implies what precedes that couplet, or perhaps that the abbreviation of a certain form, if you can perceive, and this relates to our discussions, involving reification not in the Marxist sense or social political sense or even in a Freudian sense, but in the sense of cognitive science, in which okay, so say this figure right here, right? Well, so can you see the triangularity, the triangle within that exists between this aspect of the vegetation and then this lower aspect of the vegetation? There's a space, right, between those two aspects of the vegetation, and they're not completed. The triangle isn't completed, but we reify the completion of the triangle, even though we can't find it. Just like I've talked about more exists up here, even though it's off the page, right? But we can we certainly imagine them. The ontological world of the diegesis in which this serpent is configured doesn't suddenly stop just because I leave the screen, right? So all of that is an example of reification. But in Zorn's lemma, this idea of partial sets and the constitution, right, and reconstitution of what would you say, definitional elements, and this is played out right in Hollis Frampton's exploration of these objects that designate, this alphabetical representation of, and the way that it plays with this, this historical, pedagogical learning tool, the base state primer, right? And so it plays all of this out in relationship to the concepts in Zorn's lemma, with or without the apostrophe, and that idea, seems to be coming back here as well. All right, so how is Zorn's lemma going to help us to determine whether Gertrude Stein or Pablo Picasso, or let's say it's Alfred Jarry, right? There's no question Alfred Jarry belongs to the Avant-Garde. I think that's fairly incontrovertible. I mean, the only possible objection, to Alfred Jarry belonging to the Avant-Garde is you could say that, well, there was no Avant-Garde at the time, and so you can't utilize Alfred Jarry as an example of the Avant-Garde, since too many of the propositions of the Avant-Garde, result from the statement which is Alfred Jarry. In other words, if you were to say that the Avant-Garde, was a 20th century, propositional, right, outcome of an initial statement, made by the conceptually organizing unit, Alfred Jarry, and thus Alfred Jarry cannot be included in the set from which those propositions, evolve or devolve, if you prefer. Then that would be the only way that you could constitute his exclusion, right, from that set. But otherwise, too many of the constituent elements that we understand are already there, right? That he belongs to a group, that the avant-garde is a group formation, that there is transgression involved, that there is a radical break with the past, that there is a critique, of the basic, social organization in which the aesthetic propositions emerge, etc., etc., etc. So the overdeterminism of Jarry belonging to the set that we understand as the avant-garde is too great under any condition other than that which defines Alfred Jarry as an instantiating statement, and the propositions resulting from that statement belonging to what truly constitutes the avant-garde. You get the idea. But let's say we have a different understanding of the propositions and axioms and definitions that constitute the avant-garde, and let's say that it belongs more to the constitution of an idea like Zorn's lemma. Well, it's at first looking at Zorn's lemma, it's fairly difficult to understand how it might help us to define whether Cage or Gertrude Stein, or I think we can exclude William Carlos Williams no matter what, but how Pablo Picasso may or may not belong to this construct of the avant-garde, but if we think of Zorn's lemma in terms of its equivalents, right, then it becomes slightly less difficult to understand how this could be utilized to make determinations about sets involving high modernism versus the avant-garde, and certain kinds of sorting, and how those sortings might be performed under the conditions of something, at least if not identical with Zorn's lemma, something equivalent to it. And there are three basic equivalents to Zorn's lemma in mathematics. One's the Hofdorf maximal principle, which I find somewhat difficult to imagine utilizing as a sorting tool of that helps us sort the difference between grand pianos and street tacos. But another one is the well ordering theorem, and that's perhaps conceptually slightly more evocative or provocative in relationship to the idea of how we might conceive of certain kinds of sorting in relationship to high art and the avant-garde. But the one that really appeals to me is the third equivalent of Zorn's lemma, which is the axiom of choice. And the axiom of choice. The axiom of choice, basically represents the idea. It proposes that, for any collection of objects, so let's imagine that a collection of objects is the collection of objects is defined by a movement, right? Let's just say that it's defined by a movement. So cubism is a collection of objects. Futurism is a collection of objects. Imagism is a collection of objects, right? And then that in any collection of objects, given these multiple collections, it is possible, to construct another set, by arbitrarily choosing one object from each of the sets of objects. Even if the collection is infinite, right? Now, what if we understand that the definition of the avant-garde is not the set of or the possibility of any number of these movements, to begin with, like okay, there's a set of there's a number of collections, right? And this movement is a collection. Cubism is a collection. Abstract expressionism is a collection. This and this and this and this and this. But what if the avant-garde, is not the movement itself, but the manner in which, right? The manner in which the new set is constituted, draws upon, selects one element, and maybe it's not one, maybe it's not quite an axiom of choice, but maybe it's something like one, and it selects, one element from this. So say that it was cubism, right? And say that maybe there was a precursor to cubism, which was let's just say that it was Cezanne, and this way that he had of lineating space, right, and simplifying contour. And so, like, if Cezanne were drawing this green snake, maybe he wouldn't put in all of these curved lines. Maybe he would simplify into straight lines based upon this idea of horizontal, vertical, and horizon, right? This very much horizon-focused way of organizing space, and this much kind of architectural way, almost as a draftsman organizing space. So this idea of the draftsman, let's say that one of these jars is the draftsmanship of Cezanne, and you're defining the avant-garde as choosing one element from each of these jars, and then say there's another jar, and that jar says that we're this jar says we're looking outside of what's traditional to the culture that we belong to, so in Spain, right, there's this history that moves from well, from classical art, through the Renaissance and then through the Baroque, the great, Baroque artists of Spain, right, are like this obstacle that Pablo Picasso has to overcome. Like, how is he, ever going to get, how is he ever going to get beyond or even compete with, a painter like Velázquez or Zurbarán or stepping out of the Baroque, even a mannerist like El Greco, right? And all of this stuff that's in El Prado. One of the ways that one could imagine, is it belongs to this the solution set that that we've adopted from the axiom of choice as defining the avant-garde as taking one object from each of these sets, and one of these sets is defined by draftsmanship that and abstraction, right? Draftsmanship and abstraction, the simplification, right, of form. And another set is defined by seeking an aesthetic choice outside of one's traditional culture. So rather than depicting the lives of the saints or ordinary objects or monarchs or members of the royal family, like that one might find in in the Baroque period, which is more quotidian social reality, or in the Mannerist period that harkens back to these to the mythos logos, right? That's the same defining feature as existed in the Renaissance. That is, this Christian narrative, right? So select something other than that, right? And you'll notice that, like when Picasso begins his career, maybe he's not avant-garde yet when he's painting the Saltimbanque, right? And the circus, characters, or even the guy with the guitar, because these are all themes that belong to the culture. Or maybe you can define it as a partial set of movements, from axiom of choice, and it's connected with other sets. Maybe it's also connected with, maybe there's a way like that we can bring the axiom of choice and it's that is in some way an equivalent to Zorn's lemma, to another construct. Maybe there's a von Neumann universe set that we can utilize to understand the way that these selections made by Pablo Picasso help us understand him as avant-garde. In any case, so let's say that the first set is draftsmanship and abstraction, and that he chooses that from this kind of Cezanne set, or or maybe it's not Cezanne, maybe it's also belongs to other emerging experimenters who are experimenting with certain kinds of abstract simplification, not just Cezanne, but others. And in a certain way, color simplification, is represented in Picasso as well. And let's say he doesn't get that from Cezanne, because Cezanne has these pretty subtle, shadings of these pastels, right? But maybe he gets that. Maybe he gets color from Van Gogh. But it still belongs to this same jar, or if we want to call it a pithos or a box or whatever, if we want to mistranslate it or translate it into a jar. But it belongs to this axiom of choice idea that there's some kind of set, and we're conceiving of this set as a jar or something that contains stuff. And out of it, you choose simplification, and that could be simplification of line or simplification of color. So maybe in that set, Van Gogh's in that set in a certain way, and Gauguin's in that set, and they're both in that set via color, right? And additionally, they're both in that set because there's a certain kind of primitive way in which the details of the realism is left out. They're in that set because they're both patternists, right? And Matisse is in that set because he's a patternist. And he's not, and that set doesn't define the avant-garde, right? That set doesn't define the avant-garde. That's just a set that defines you as a patternist or a simplifier, right? As either an architect, that is a draftsman in Cézanne's case, or a simplifier and a patternist in Matisse's case, and whatever else, right? So from that jar of simplification, he chooses simplification of Picasso does. He chooses simplification of color, and he chooses simplification of lineation and contour. And whoever he gets them from, he chooses maybe chooses one or maybe chooses two objects from that. And then he moves on to this other set, this is the set of choices made outside of one's own culture. And Gauguin also belongs to that set too. So in addition to belonging to this set of simplification and patterning, Gauguin, not so much Van Gogh, but Gauguin belongs to this set. Do stuff outside your own culture. And what does he do? He does stuff outside of France, and where he does it is he does it in Tahiti. And whether that is colonially problematic or not, which it certainly is, and I'm not claiming that it isn't, but maybe it belongs to this set, and out of which the avant-garde is prone to choose and collect. But remember, that set isn't an avant-garde set. What's avant-garde is the selection itself, the way that axiom of choice, the action, the activity of the selections, from these various sets becomes what constitutes the avant-garde. And maybe there's no minimal or maximal number of moves that have to be made to constitute whether one's engagement, as an act of choosing from these various jars, right, constitutes the avant-garde. But maybe there's a critical mass somehow that's reached, and you just have this intuitive sense. Well, he chose from enough of these jars that we can say that he's avant-garde. Maybe there's a jar of transgression, and maybe if you choose enough things from that jar of transgression and combine it with a couple of things from some of these other jars, then you can say, well, that kind of choosing is definitely an example of the avant-garde, right? So what's this outside of culture that Pablo Picasso chooses from? Well, largely it's African sculpture, right? It's in I always have trouble pronouncing this word. So maybe I need to have less enthusiasm and just slow down. In Demoiselles d'Avignon, right? The choice outside the culture is clearly African sculpture. Now he brings it to obviously this very traditional portrayal of the female nude, and there's a kind of collision of these two cultures that's made, and maybe the collision is one of the requirements in the axiom of choice kind of selection that's made, right? Maybe that the reason that Cézanne, and whatever he does, and the architectonics and the simplification into line and this kind of draftsmanship quality, right? Maybe there's really no collision, although I think it would be seen much more in Cézanne's time than we would recognize it today. Having this long history of post-impressionism that we've had to live with it and sort of get accustomed to and acquire its taste. But maybe there's a jar, maybe there's a separate jar that includes this idea of a collision, between two elements, and that would be like the jar of discord, or that would be, and then if there were a jar of discord or dissonance, then we could put Stravinsky in that jar, right? But we could see that Stravinsky also belonged to this idea of choosing from jars, a number of different jars, and he chose from this jar of discord. But he also chose from this jar of, this jar of what you could call expressivity, right? And expressivity, you might say, well, okay, well, isn't that just another way of saying the jar of discord? Well, perhaps, but maybe not. And maybe expressivity, right, like as it belongs to, you see the discord there as it belongs to the German expressionists, right? But there's something else. There's something reaching into this idea of a kind of like not entirely desublimated emotivity and expression, but there's definitely an element of desublimation going on, and you feel that desublimation in Stravinsky. And then one could say, well, isn't desublimation just another way of talking about dissonance? And I don't think so, because there's a lot of discord and dissonance in Marcel Duchamp, but there's very little expressivity in terms of emotionality, and and like the way that like the blues like reaches into this notion of collective consciousness, and draws from it, this emotional experience of the past and puts it into this articulation of the cry, right? And you see the cry in something like Edvard Munch in a way that you certainly don't see it in in the work of other kinds of what you could say are discordant and dissonant uses of sound from Duchamp and the futurists, perhaps through Edgar Varese and other musicians, but in other domains and color movements as well. So anyway, and I'm not going to exhaustively like define these collections of jars from which the avant-garde draws, and maybe they're infinite, and it doesn't really matter, because what matters is this operative drawing from. So it's one way of imagining like the idea of at least an equivalent of Zorn's lemma, contributing to a model for understanding the avant-garde, right? But I think where we broke off in this digression, and I'm not even sure I can recall anymore, the reason for our breaking off was that I was telling a story of the caduceus and of Hermes, and this story, perhaps also, involves the idea of misremembering or confusion or getting it wrong, making a mistake. And so this staff that originally belonged to Hermes came to be associated with the two serpents and the coiling of the two serpents around the staff, right? Because of this story of Hermes, separating these snakes, and of course that story, as allegory or as metaphor, represents this idea of the messenger resolving, conflicts, and in a sense, it's a story, that involves dialectic, right, in a certain way, and how it became associated with medicine is somewhat confusing, but the confusion may result from an initial misremembering or an initial getting it wrong. And somehow this staff and then this story associated with the staff came to be associated with not with Hermes, but with Asclepius, right? The individual who was given the gift of medicine and taught the medicinal arts. I think Chiron was his teacher, wasn't it? And Chiron's story is interesting too, because in addition to being initially wounded by his own form, right? Chiron, you could say, is an example of his physicality is non-normative, right? he's not a child of centaurs. Chiron is in fact the child of Kronos and Philyra, the Oceanid, and his initial wounding is which is often referred to as in at least in our time as the wounded healer, and his initial wounding is the separation because of his physical difference from his parents, and he's expelled, right, from the community because he is different, and he is different in this way that his hindquarters seem to be that of an animal, a horse, and he's not, right, he is not in that sense, he's not even really a centaur, or descended from this imaginary race of creatures known as centaurs, and his final wounding, right, which is an accident, his final wounding, which is it's the result of an accident, and inflicted by one of his own students, Hercules. And as I recall the story, and I may be wrong, but that somehow Chiron is dwelling amongst or visiting the true centaurs, who include their leader Nessus, and somehow this fight over some sacred wine or something results in a conflict between Nessus and Hercules, and this conflict leads to armed engagement, and Hercules utilizes his weapons, and one of these weapons includes this bow and arrow, and his arrows are dipped in the blood of a kind of serpent, or one could say dragon, but a kind of serpent, the Hydra, who as one of the duties of performing his various labors that Hercules has already, or Heracles has already dispatched, and after dispatching he dips his arrows in the blood of this monster, this creature, the Hydra, which is poison, and in the course of defending, or not really defending himself, but in the course of engaging in this conflict, Hercules accidentally wounds Chiron with the one of these arrows, which is poisoned with the poison of what I'm going to call a serpent, right? So it's interesting that the student, if I'm correct in remembering the stories, that the student of Chiron's Asclepius, symbol, it becomes, this caduceus, by accident or misremembering or getting it wrong, that originally belonged to Hermes, the messenger, and the idea of the serpent's coil, which originally represented the resolution of conflict, right, and the separation of conflict by the power of this staff, the power of the messenger, becomes an image for healing, and in the hands of Asclepius, who if not directly, at least in relationship to his history as the student of Chiron, perhaps in some way, although distantly, relates metonymically or associatively to this story the death of the healer by poison, right? By the poison of a serpent, and often in cultures that represent powers and abilities in representations of these animal spirits. Often the serpent or the snake is represented as the healer, and in addition to a number of other characteristics that might define its symbolism. But the green snake here definitely speaks to me of the idea of the healer. And so anyway, in this story of the caduceus, that this particular image and an entity and ekphrasis reminds me of. I'm also reminded of this story of that probably grows out of some kind of a misremembering or associative remembering that doesn't really belong to the proper set in which we could place the caduceus, which is Hermes' set, right? So it's been drawn out of its box or its pithos or its jar or its vase or whatever we want to call that set into which it properly belongs, and it's been reassigned and designated to the healer Asclepius, and that reassignment, that drawing out, which is perhaps not the axiomatic, the axiom of choice, that through which we defined the avant-garde, but it's a similar displacement, and maybe displacement, is another way of thinking about an operation of the avant-garde, and that's probably where I'm leading up to and going with some of this, because but I had forgotten to talk about. Somehow we digressed from a movement that I was making toward the justification in whatever we decide to call or name this piece, the justification of this double articulation of the two fives, and one of those fives grew out of the story represented in that piece, that cinematic piece created in 2013 called The Grand Piano, and the instigating stage fright that resulted from a piece called La Cinquette, and perhaps La Cinquette, in addition to being a reference to a number of other aesthetic ideas, grows out of this idea of the perfection required by each of the two sets of 5 fingers on the hand. If one is going to be a concert pianist and perform on the symbolic object of the grand piano that requires the muse of perfection, then one has to have nimble fingers, just as if one wants to belong to the high art domain, represented by facility and clarity and all of these classical elements that still belong to this domain, then one is going to have have perfected, right, the control and discipline of one's fingers, just like if one wants to belong to this high art domain of lyric poetry, one is going to have perfected the performance and use of one's tongue and the skills of one's grammar. And it seems to me that idea of perfection may not be one of the jars from which the avant-garde is allowed to choose. And maybe we'll get to that at some point. But I believe I by means of digression, regression, aggression, or transgression, I believe that I failed to complete a thought that I had begun quite a long time back in this discourse, and that thought was that I had remembered when I was engaged in the social services and when I was a job developer, as I had explained earlier in this talk, that my supervisor, and I don't remember where I trailed off and where I lost the end of that particular tale, but it definitely did result from a digression, and maybe digression was one of the jars that I was choosing from when I got lost. But the end of the story was that my supervisor approached me and said about these various presentations that I was making to these different sets, right, or these different communities, or these different organizations of individuals, what was the following. So in a way, we're relating back to this the idea of Zorn's lemma again in Axiom of choice, and also to another idea, the idea of context, bearing upon the both mean, not both meaning, meaning, form, strategy, architectonics of communication, so that this snake, right? This snake configured in a relationship to caduceus will not be the same snake that it is configured in a relationship to, say, transformation, right? Because the snake sheds its skin, it is also configured as a symbol of transformation. It's really the serpent's relationship to medicine, is probably an archaic, right? An archaic exploration of the unconscious fear of the poisonous snake, and the transmogrification or the transmutation of the fear of such poison, and of the transfiguration of the fear of death, and as it is represented in the threat of poison, into the healing of and transmogrification of poison into medicine, right? Whether that medicine is liquid or symbolic or virtual or it takes the form of a pill, but the poison of the snake becomes the healing medicine, right? And that is probably the archaic deployment of the unconscious in formulating this serpent as the symbol of healing. Now formulating the serpent as symbol of transmutation and change, comes from elsewhere, and I would suggest that it comes from the shedding of the serpent's skin. There are other transformations, and there are other symbolic, entities, like animal or otherwise, that represent transformation, but can come to represent transformation by other means. For example, all living creatures, who experience a process of morphological metamorphosis, butterflies, frogs, dragonflies, and many, many other creatures, begin in one element or begin in one form and are transformed, via this process of metamorphosis into an entirely new form, right? And by virtue of that process of metamorphosis, they're often associated with the very idea of metamorphosis and change and transformation. But the serpent or the snake, is not a metamorphosizing animal in that sense, but a shedding animal, and thus gains its status and significance as a symbol of change and transformation via other means, right? But where I had forgotten, and before I digress too much further, where I had gotten lost in the telling of this story and the advice that I was provided by my supervisor was the following. She said, keep in mind that you're talking to a number of different audiences, and the presentation that you make, should in the presentation that you make, you should become aware of that. And then she oversimplified, but she said, she said that think about this, right? Think about it as an issue of, and I don't know if she used the word aesthetics or if she used a different word, but she said think about it, and I'm just going to use the word aesthetics. Think about it as a kind of aesthetics or kind of value, right? That different classes, and she was really comfortable with using like the oversimplification of these class distinctions in a way that many people might not be, and I'm not advocating for this oversimplification here. I'm just repeating it. But she said the working class is concerned with quantity. So if imagine that, so you imagine you're going out for a meal. So the working class really loves the buffet, or the salad bar, because they're hungry, because they don't get enough to eat. And she didn't say that. I'm adding this, so I'm throwing this in. But maybe that's lurking there in the unconscious. And even if they're not hungry, and they do get enough to eat, maybe they remember a time when they didn't. Like I always remember my Mennonite grandparents, telling me, and this, my grandmother in particular, and both of my grandparents, but belonged to these families of 12 or 13 children, right? And my grandmother was the youngest. So she talks about, learning to like the neck of the chicken if they had chicken, because that was the only piece that she could get, without, fighting over, right? So she has memories, of being hungry. And so she always made a lot of food, right? There was always like this overabundance of food. And when I spent summers at my grandparents' house, I'd always return, home to my mother, my single parent mother, 10 pounds, fatter than I had been when I left. And this in weather that was, like from 100 to 110 degrees a day in the San Joaquin Valley. This was, back in the 70s. But and probably even hotter than that now, and it's probably why we don't grow our own food here in the United States anymore, because it's just too hot because of global warming and climate change. But that's again another digression. So anyway, whether it's because they're actually hungry or carry memories of hungry, or this anxiety of hunger, quantity is an aesthetic concern, or if not an aesthetic concern, a part of the economy of desire, let's say. And then she said, and for the middle class, the issue is quality, right? The issue is quality, and I guess quality would be you hit all the right notes, you don't stutter when you perform your reading, that there's a certain flow, that you don't make any mistakes, I suppose, right? And then like however we define quality, quality in a restaurant is this is not prepackaged food. It's fresh. It's locally grown, and it's and maybe quality includes the idea of innovation in a certain way and design and all of this, and that seems like to take care of everything, right? Well, what's beyond quality and quantity? Those seem to be, if one wanted to binarize, right? Well, like, what are two aspects of what completes the plenitude of a thing? Well, one aspect of plenitude is quality, and the other feature is quantity. But she said, but for the rich, right? For the upper class, it's neither quantity nor quality, but presentation. So presentation, is yet another feature. And I suppose that in presentation, once again, we find, the feature of the grand piano. Because is it really, say that it's cage in a way. Say that it's cage. And someone's performing 4 minutes and 33 seconds, or someone misremembered it as so say someone misremembered it, right, as 3 minutes and 44 seconds. That would be a problem, because it would interfere with quality, right? And it also interferes with quantity, right? Because the quantification of the time, you got it wrong. There's an error there, right? And maybe that makes it even more avant-garde. Like maybe misremembering and doing cage, doing 433 as 344. Maybe that's even more avant-garde because you chose from this other box. Or maybe it just represents an error, and you want to exclude that because you don't want error in your piece, because you're still thinking of it in these high art terms, right? But in any case, the presentation of it, if you do it with the grand piano, that's all about presentation. It's not really about quality, because say that you wanted it to be about quality, then you could do it. You could do it with anything. You could do it whether the grand piano was there or not, right? You could have someone sitting in a chair, and it wouldn't matter if the guy sitting in the chair or the woman sitting in the chair or whoever you wanted to put in the chair, who could possibly represent someone who can play the piano. Say. Maybe and it'd be interesting to bring other dimensions into it. Say that we wanted to do it. We wanted to do a social political piece. Now, recently, in the news, there was an article, and I think I read this in National Public Radio, where a transgender woman in Miami had been placed in a male detention center, whether that was a jail or a prison, I can't remember, But it was clear from the context of this discussion that the failure to protect this woman physically and emotionally, and to satisfy the needs of her safety, that these were overlooked in order to make this political point, and perhaps to terrorize her. Right, and I unfortunately can't remember the name of this individual, and I believe that she was released. But it was clearly political, and it was clearly malicious, and it was clearly a vicious violation of her rights. Right. So what if, right? So what if in the presentation of 433 that you wanted, right, to not only perform the piece, but to perform it in some kind of social political context, that bears upon our present moment and all of the abuses, right, and violations of the rights of all, right, like sexually and sexual identifying non-binary individuals in our culture are experiencing. in the wake of this, neo-Christian fascism that we are experiencing in this moment, right? What if you wanted to do that? Well, in addition to, choosing a performer, who might, more clearly, represent, the social force of the discourse that you want to produce. In other words, choosing an individual, whose narrative identity, right, is known and defined as belonging to a self-understanding as transgender or non-binary in any other way, right? You might choose a different costume than say the traditional tuxedo that concert pianists perform in, or the traditional gown that female concert pianists perform in, and maybe you want to do something to your grand piano to change. I'm not entirely certain that a grand piano has gender, but I'm not entirely certain that a grand piano is entirely unmarked by gender either, right? And it certainly conveys a lot of cultural significance that bears upon in gender in multiple ways, historically and formally, perhaps as well, if one takes that curved representation of the strings that is presented formally in its design as a reference to originally, right, the Orpheus's lyre and the word lyre, from which we derive the etymological evolution of the word, toward, making its way toward lyric, or we could say lyric, the word lyric, understanding its own genealogy as belonging to this original musical element that accompanied the poetry of Orpheus. Now, what's interesting is that that Orpheus's muse was not lyric, right? It was epic poetry. His mother, if you recall, was Calliope, and Calliope is the muse of epic poetry, not lyric poetry, right? So perhaps that also is a confusion, or the idea of that lyric poetry can be identified as something other than narrative poetry, and certainly something other than epic poetry, and that its etymology results from this word that signified Orpheus's harp, is perhaps another misrecognition or error. And perhaps these errors and misrecognitions that belong to these interesting histories and lineages and etymologies are something like the domains of rhetorical deception that David Antin talks about, and that we are re-articulating in his work. In other words, these domains of rhetorical deception, like whether like Kathy Acker really studied under Herbert Marcuse or not, right? And that David says results in the production of this kind of space of storytelling, in which Kathy can engage as a discursive, right, as a discursive engagement, as an argument, as a confrontation, this construct of repressive desublimation, within her set, of aesthetic concerns that so very much involve the production of these transgressive challenges, right, to the culture. And then we could say this belongs to this punk ethos in a certain way, but that it goes way back, further than we generally associate punk with. But and you see in figures like Alfred Jarry or Arthur Rimbaud, and it's certainly there in punk artists like like those who emerged in the 70s and 80s in music. And I'm thinking of Patti Smith in particular, but certainly there in the Sex Pistols and the Dead Kennedys, and certainly there in the Stooges and this particular modality of punk. And there may be ways in which we have to come back to the axiom of choice and think about punk too, because if you think about a punk band like the Gang of Four, right, who are extraordinarily and profoundly political, but barely transgressive. At least the transgressive isn't one of the vectors of signification that I easily can concede to the maybe it's there in the sound in a certain way, but it's certainly not there in the content, and largely not there in the performativity either. So maybe maybe punk too has its trajectories, but the idea of transgression that belongs to it was certainly a part of what attracted Kathy Acker to this punk ethos, and the fiction, right, or the deception, the rhetorical deception or the fiction that surrounds her personal narrative and autobiography that belongs to this claim of being the student of Herbert Marcuse. My argument and David's argument has always been, it represents this discursive domain in which she allows herself to engage the problem of transgression as it confronts this historicization of a kind of end, right? Because theorists are always telling you that something is over, whether the avant-garde is over in cinema or the avant-garde is over in poetry. And it's always interesting because it's always these critics and theorists always tell you that they're the last generation. After us there could no longer be an avant-garde. Even though what we do is mostly high art, right? And we were never really avant-garde to begin with, but we liked the idea of being avant-garde in this safe middle class way, right? and it's really this safe middle class way of doing this that's an example of the avant-garde, and the avant-garde doesn't have anything to do with the axiom of choice, right? It only has to do with the way that we use parataxis or whatever it might be, right? So maybe accident can also perform this function and open up the spaces that belong to engagements of discursive domain, and maybe that it was no accident that Asclepius stole the caduceus from Hermes and redeployed it, as medicine. And maybe he did that because he knew something about, poisonous snakes. Bless you. That's Leo sneezing. The dogs are having a good time. And likewise, maybe maybe other examples of these kinds of errors, belong to these, or can develop into these domains of of discourse, and maybe that's what Freud's idea of error having a significance is, that there really is no error. There's only a motivation to move something from someplace to someplace else. So I'm not really going to take a stand on that and say if there's no error or if there's error. But I certainly understand the idea that behind every error is a motivation to move something from here to over there. And in the course of moving it, you change it, right? I'm reminded, because we've been talking about the caduceus, I'm reminded of this other parapraxis that I performed, somewhere in one of the pieces, and I can't even remember, which piece it was, but I remember the parapraxis that I performed, and it was that, I'm reminded of this because I'm thinking about the caduceus, but it wasn't about a caduceus and getting a story about a caduceus wrong, or reinterpreting that story and putting it in a new discursive domain. But it was something that, but it was something like a caduceus, and what it was a thyrsus, and I had confused the Greek word thyrsus, which is like a caduceus. It's a wand or a staff, I think generally of giant fennel, but it's covered with ivy and leaves and vines and all of this vegetation, and that vegetation symbolizes its relationship to the god of the vine, Dionysus, and it's Dionysus symbol, and it has these magical capacities, just like the caduceus in the hands of Asclepius does, right? And but its powers are somewhat different, right? It's what I believe it's what Dionysus utilizes to incite his followers into frenzied madness and sort of the devotional bacchanalia, right? So the thyrsus is like this sacred instrument of rituals and fetes and festivals of Dionysus, and as such, if I recall correctly, figures into Euripides, the Bacchae, and other tellings of these Dionysian revelries. Okay. So this is from, I think, from the Bacchae, right? When Pentheus say, the thyrsus in my right hand, shall I hold it, or thus am I more like a bacchanal? And Dionysus says, in thy right hand, and with thy right foot, raise it. And so the holding, right? The holding of this instrument, and the choice of which hand it's held in, it becomes significant as well. But what I'm remembering, but again we digress. But have chosen a lot from this jar of digression. But let's remember where we were going, and where we were going was that somewhere in one of these talks I had remembered the word for door, and the Greek word for door is thura, and I had said I had used the word I wanted to signify the Greek word for door, but what I said was thyrsus, and I can see why I was drawn to that error, because the idea of the thyrsus is so much more interesting than the idea of thura, of door or porthole in Greek. At least in my memory of the way that it's used in these various mythoi, right? And it has more impact for me, and perhaps if I wanted to push it, I could say, because I'm always having to make choices about when I film these things, in what hand I'm holding the camera, the recording device, and if I'm petting a dog with the other hand, and what is the implement of the magic, and in which hand is it held, and maybe pushing it, that was also lurking there in my memory of Pentheus, and why this weird conversation, right, with Dionysus regarding which hand to hold the thyrsus in. In my right hand shall I hold it? He says, it's like, well, or thus am I more like a bacchanal, and why? Because he had to hold something in the other hand, presumably, or there wouldn't be this conversation. And what is being held in the other hand? Well, the cup, obviously, right? The wine cup. And so what does it mean, like, to imbibe and become drunk, as opposed to be the possessor of an object that makes drunk, right? Or inspires madness. So really what he's asking is, shall I be the active participant in the driving into frenzy, or shall I receive from you the frenzy, from which your elixir, your poison in a certain sense, right? It relates back to, because it's wine and it intoxicates, it relates back to a kind of like midpoint, I suppose, between what is poison and what is medicine, and it depends on your relationship to this particular substance that we call alcohol, like whether you regard it, as a medicine or a poison. So anyway, the idea of the caduceus, reminded me of the thyrsus, and the thyrsus reminded me of this confusion that I had made, this parapraxis that I had parapraxis, right, not parataxis, that I had performed in confusing the word thura for the word thyrsus. I'm gonna take a break here because the dogs are getting so they're having so much fun, and but it's a little bit distracting, and we have to move forward because there's something that I really want to talk about. This has gone on long enough that I'll probably break this here, put it up, and then return at some point. And we may have a different representation of me when I return. I may not be this green serpent. I may be another character. But I want to conceive of this as still part of the intermission and or the interlude.